Well, it is a pleasure to be with all of you today. I love being in a room with like-minded people who love family, who love liberty, and who love our country and are people of faith. And sometimes doing this work, I don't know about you, feels lonely. So to be here with all of you is very comforting. My name is Cline, and I'm the founder of It Takes a Family. I educate and equip parents with the knowledge and skills necessary to strengthen family trust and confidence. My goal is to help parents reclaim parenthood. But this wasn't always my story. I'm a former comprehensive sex educator and Title X training manager of over 10 years. I was trained by both the gay community and Planned Parenthood. I not only taught comprehensive sex education, but I also lived it. I started this career in 1996. Planned Parenthood was integral in teaching me how to reach school-age children. I received a private training from the director of sex education in Austin, Texas. She began my training by making the case for comprehensive sex education. She described girls as young as 10 coming into Planned Parenthood with objects in their bodies, sexually transmitted diseases, and yes, even having abortions. And I was horrified by the stories, and my first reaction was, teach me how to teach these girls not to have sex. She reached over and patted me on the knee and she said, no, dear, we're not going to teach them not to have sex. We're going to teach them how to do it safer. You see, we meet them where they're at and we teach them how to do it safer. Telling them not to have sex is judging because you're judging their choices. My heart sank, but I was convinced. I knew, this was the expert, right? This is the person, this is Planned Parenthood receiving Title X funding. They're receiving all sorts of funding, so I thought I could trust her. So here's the first activity that she taught me, which is meant to break down the natural inhibitions of our children. The kids are asked to name their reproductive parts from medically accurate terms to slang terminology. At first, the kids are shy. But when they notice that the authority in the room is encouraging them, they become a bit more comfortable and begin to share out loud. By the end of the activity, even the most shy student is participating and giggling. Sometimes the educator may even ask the kids to use a marker to write the words themselves on the board. And what's left on the board is a collage of crass and dehumanizing words that objectify the human person and sexual activity. Now that they're comfortable with these sexual terms, the next lesson is to talk about their different types of sex. We covered oral sex, vaginal sex, and anal sex and all its associated bodily fluids. It means we talked about sex toys, tattoos, piercings, multiple partners, condom negotiation, dental dams, saran wrap, role plays to practice the negotiation skills, and informing partners about sexually transmitted infections. So whether those children were actually sexually active or not, it was the comprehensive sex educator's job to introduce them to every possible form of sex, which objectifies and dehumanizes the person and normalizes sex at a young age. So what just happened here? Let me break it down for you. Planned Parenthood attempts to convince the culture that the sexual risk avoidance message brings judgment to people. Planned Parenthood does not believe in moral absolutes, but rather relativism. They believe that moral absolutes are judgmental, and they use that lie to silence parents and the culture. They've reduced our children and humanity down to very animalistic level. They're basically saying that kids are sexual from birth and are driven by their sexual desires, especially at puberty. They believe that they can't help themselves and they shouldn't have to, and they call this their sexual rights. And that's the next point, sexual rights. When we talk about someone having rights taken from them, we envision an oppressor. So who is the oppressor? Who in all the world would not want children having sex? The parent. Planned Parenthood views protective, conservative, faith-filled, moral absolute believing parents as pesky and a barrier to service. In my 10 years working with Planned Parenthood, at every training, at every workshop, and at every conference, I always heard, this is their quote, parents are a barrier to service. Planned Parenthood endears themselves to youth and attempts to replace the parent using secrets, or as the CDC calls it, privacy and confidentiality. Point number 4, grooming and sexual abuse. The activity used to break down inhibitions is very much like grooming for sexual abuse. It is a slow progression of getting children comfortable with talking about sexually explicit topics with adults who are not their parents. Basically, comprehensive sex education breaks down inhibitions and prepares children for sexual activity and sexual discussions. My belief is that this type of education normalizes sexually explicit conversations with adults who are not their parents, placing these children at risk of being coerced by sexual predators in person and online, because it's become normalized. The last step is to promote the use of condoms, lubrication, testing, treatment, and abortion. You see, when Planned Parenthood teaches children to objectify themselves and the sexual act, then it's just a natural next step to then objectify and dehumanize the unborn child. Then that cycle can start all over again. And that is the great hope of Planned Parenthood. Sexual freedom is promoted by them, by SICAs, by advocates for youth, and they are using comprehensive sex education to change the sexual attitudes of a whole generation of children so that they'll treat sex as an object, as a material thing to gain pleasure, all the while putting themselves at risk of pregnancies and disease. Planned Parenthood asked me to fill in for them at an alternative school in East Austin. They were considered high-risk youth. They were the ages of 13, 14-year-old boys and girls. I was teaching them HIV prevention, and normally when I would walk into the classroom, I'd write all the forms of sex on this side of the board and all the bodily fluids on this side. So I had oral sex, vaginal sex, anal sex listed here, blood, semen, vaginal secretions on the other side, and I started the conversation. A young girl raised her hand and asked a question, and I'll clean it up for you just a little bit. She said, "When I give boys oral sex, I gag. Can you teach me how to do it better?" I had the same reaction as you did. I decided to reflect that question back to her. And I said, "It sounds that when you're involved in this activity, you have this reaction and you don't like it." She said, "That's right, I don't like it. But if you teach me how to do it better, maybe I will." So I simply said, "Have you ever considered just not doing the activity that you don't like?" And she stared at me, a little dumbfounded. And all the kids turned in their chairs and looked at me with the same look on their face. And I realized I had said something they'd never heard of. And I said, "Guys, do you realize that you don't have to have sex? Do you realize that you don't have to have anal sex, oral sex, or vaginal sex? And if you don't, then you won't come into contact with any of these bodily fluids, and you won't be concerned about sexually transmitted diseases, and you won't be concerned about pregnancy." And the same little girl raised her hand and said, "Ma'am, no one's ever told us that." No one, not their parents, not the community, and especially not all of us outreach workers working together in that community, knocking on doors and passing out condoms. Next thing I know, these kids start talking about ways that they can avoid having sex. And I thought, as a risk reduction educator, I lost control of the room. But I was okay with that because these kids were coming up with some amazing ideas. They thought, one boy said, "Hey, we can go to the park and play basketball." And the same girl who asked the question said, "I'm better at basketball than you are. I'll beat you." And he said, "That's okay. I still want to play." Another girl said, "There's free movies at the community center, and they have free snacks. We could just watch movies." They were huddled together thinking of ways how they could avoid having sex, because when I told them not to do what they don't like doing, obviously they didn't like doing this. They were so young. It was not natural for them. A little girl pulled away from the group and came up to me and whispered, she said, "I can't do what they're doing, right? I can't stop having sex. I'm already having sex and everyone expects me to do it, so now I can't say no." And I said, "No, honey, you can say no. No one has the right to tell you that you have to have sex. Regardless of what you've done, you can choose today not to have sex for the rest of your life if you want to, or wait until you get married. And she smiled brightly and ran back to the group and joined them. Really, the point that I want to make about that story is how much these children really want truth. And we talk about that with millennials as well, that children are really craving truth. The social change movement assumes and wants to convince parents and children that they are sexual from birth and therefore have the right to seek sexual pleasure. That is why comprehensive sex education approaches children with such a strong and graphic sexualized teaching. Let me help you understand this. There is evil in the world, but many of these educators don't know their right hand from their left. I didn't know my right hand from my left. God, in the book of Jonah, Jonah did not want to save the people of Nineveh. And at the end of that chapter, he said, God makes a plea, and he's explaining to Jonah why he needed to do this, why he needed Jonah to go share the truth to these people in Nineveh. And he described them as saying they don't know their right hand from their left. I became a comprehensive sex educator because I wanted to help people. But when you're moved by compassion without truth, it can lead down very dark paths. This is why I believe that our work must be led by God's truth. Otherwise, how would we know what's good and evil? When the kids started to talk about ways to abstain about sex, they had the right idea, no physical contact. But let me make things very clear to you. Planned Parenthood, when they talk about abstinence, they talk about heavy petting over clothes and mutual masturbation, or even the use of pornography, which obviously is still a sexual activity and will lead to intercourse. That is their version of abstaining. But these kids were able to identify alternative activities that had nothing to do with touching one another, and it was beautiful. What is very apparent to me about this story is that, like I said before, children crave truth and leadership and healthy boundaries from parents and the adults in their community. School-age children are incredibly moldable. And if you give them the message that sex is simply a recreational activity that is expected at the onset of puberty, then you have molded them to objectify themselves and others. If we talk to children about healthy marriage, intimacy, boundaries, friendship, integrity, and respect, and waiting to have sex into adulthood or preferably in marriage, then we not only protect them physically, but also mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. Planned Parenthood and this social change movement have distorted the view of our children. While conducting Title X training for Planned Parenthood in South Texas, they clearly showed me how distorted of a view they have of our children. I was talking to them about human trafficking and statutory rape, and they assured me at this conference that they were not going to report that because they did not view our young girls as victims. One nurse raised her hand and said, "Honey, if she's not with this man this month, she'll be with another one next month." In my 10 years of working alongside Planned Parenthood, it's very common knowledge that statutory rape is happening, but they do not view it that way. Because if their definition of sexuality and that children are sexual from birth and they have the right to seek sexual pleasure, then nothing can be wrong with them being sexually active, even with adult men. And they refuse to report. This is depravity. If we want to truly address teen pregnancy and the epidemic STI rates of our youth, then we need to educate and equip the one institution that can have the most positive impact for optimal health, the family. It takes a family to raise strong children. It takes a family to build healthy communities. And it takes a family to form a great nation. I created It Takes a Family because of that one lesson that Planned Parenthood taught me. When they said parents are a barrier to service, that is when I knew that parents are the key. Parents are powerful and are in the best position to speak life into their children, and that's what It Takes a Family does. We strengthen parents to lead conversations about sex, marriage, identity, and abundant life at home, in our community, and through legislation. We need to lead from home. And our children are craving to see their parents lead in the home, and craving to see their parents lead in the school, and lead when they vote, or lead when they decide to run for office. Now, I tell many parents, but the kids will roll their eyes. Embrace the eye roll. Do not be afraid of the eye roll. Have those conversations with your children. I did not teach my son. When I said that I lived comprehensive sex education, I did. I had my own unplanned pregnancy. I scheduled an abortion. But it was because a good friend of mine humanized my child through celebrating its life and imagining what he would be like as a boy, or if it was a girl, what she would look like. That she humanized my child, and I chose to cancel that abortion appointment, and I have a son today. And I thank you. And when Planned Parenthood introduced me to Robbie Harris, the author who wrote It's Perfectly Normal, and handed me her book, I knew that that wasn't something I was going to share with my child. I don't have time to share my conversion story with you, but it is because God called me. He revealed himself to me, and I accepted him as my Savior. And as soon as that happened, he began to transform me and sanctify me. And all of a sudden, I realized as I was managing these comprehensive sex education, interventions in the community, God began to show me how these interventions were slowly killing an already vulnerable population of people. And by the time Planned Parenthood told me that they didn't view our young girls having sex with older men as victims, and refused to report cases of human trafficking, that was the last straw, and I had to leave. It's time that we make family great again. It's time, yes. And I do believe that there are many grassroots ways that we can do that. We need to strengthen our churches. We need to be there and lift up our pastors because they're afraid too. We all know that we get attacked out in the community. But we do need our churches to be strong, and we need to help them. We need to educate them, and we need to be there for them, our pastors, when they're attacked. We need to support our families. We need to give parents the resources that they need so that they can confidently lead at home. It's very important to me that we begin to lead again in this country. And I do believe that we're winning, and I love to hear every speaker say that. We are winning. And it's going to take one person at a time to choose to lead, to choose to stand, and to choose to speak no matter what the consequence. Thank you so much for hearing my story.